Naghasik ng takot ang militar sa puso ng mga pangkaraniwang Pilipino. Naging brutal ito, lalong-lalo na sa mga naglakas loob na kalabanin ng rehimeng Marcos. Marami sa mga ito ang itinulong, tinorture, o di kaya'y basta na lamang pinatay.
So today, we are going to tackle about the People Power Revolution in the Philippines. So first, let us know the history. The People Power Revolution is also known as the Edsa Revolution or the Philippine Revolution in 1986. Was a series of popular demonstrations in the Philippines that began in 1983 and culminated in 1986. The Edsa People Power gathered millions of Filipinos from all walks of life to march along Epifanio de los Santos Avenue, or known as Edsa, the main artery of Metro Manila, to end the dictatorship of President Ferdinand E. Marcos. This began a new era marked by true freedom and democracy. The spirit of movement manifested through non-violent demonstration stages in different cities and nationwide. It was a revolution marked by its peaceful means, led by a national united reclaim liberty. This event of February 25, 1986 altered the course of our nations. It showcased to the world the remarkable resolve of the Filipino people. Over the years, we have continued to remember this momentous occasion by honoring the sacrifices of all for those who fought for dictatorship.
The essence of the 1986 Edsa People's Power Revolution. Edsa People's Power was a massive peaceful protest that was aimed in restoring democracy. It was also to demand an end to the oppressive rule of the Marcos dictatorship. It also inspires the people. But what you don't know is that Edsa is more complex than that. Edsa empowered the marginalized people for a brave, inspiring movement. The Filipinos from all walks of life came together to overthrow a tyrant and the hopes of reviving democracy. Edsa was all about people coming together. It is all about a collective movement to push for a genuine change and to demand justice for the good of the people, for the good of the country. Because of this, Edsa inspires similar non-violent revolutionary movements across the world, including the tearing down of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the offspring, the reshape of global politics in the last decades. The millions of people gathered in the Edsa of 1986 should remind us and should inspire us that we collectively have the ability, we have the power to demand for justice, to lay foundations for a brighter future for our people. But it can only be done through taking actions by standing up against the inequalities and injustices of our communities. Therefore, the 1986 Edsa People's Power is worth to be remembered, as it shows how Filipino people came together to gain changes, in order to have changes and to restore democracy in the Philippines.
The events or happenings during the 1986 Edsa People's Power Revolution. The revolution was a result of the long oppressive rule of the Marcos administration. Since the martial law proclamation in 1972, there have been thousands of killings, tortures, disappearances, and human rights abuse to those who opposed the government. By the 1980s, the economy was going down, and the fraudulent snap elections took place, and this angered the people. In the early 1980s, the economy was plummeting. People started to going out on the streets little by little. The US was really pressuring Marcos to relinquish his powers. The revolt commenced when Defense Minister Juan Ponce Enrile and the Armed Forces of the Philippines Vice Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Fidel Ramos withdrew their support from the government and called upon the resignation of the President Marcos. They planned a coup d'etat, and they failed. Archbishop of Manila, Jaime Cardinal Sin, made an announcement through Catholic radio station Radio Veteras and urged the people to go to Edsa to support Minister Enrile and General Ramos. Cardinal Sin called for people to protect Enrile and Ramos. Marcos ordered his Marine Commandant, General Artemio, to bring tanks to the Edsa and kill the rebels. Minister Enrile and General Ramos knew that they will not be able to secure both camps, so they transferred from Camp Aguinaldo to Camp Crame. Meanwhile, tanks were already in Edsa and millions of people were barricading the streets. Marcos ordered the Marines through General Tadyar. General Fabian Ver of the AFP also ordered to strike wing on Villamor Air Base to strike Camp Crame. Around 6 a.m., the Air Force arrived, but instead of attacking, they finally joined forces with Minister Enrile and General Ramos. The Air Force and Reform the Armed Forces Movement, or RAM, hugged and joined forces. Eventually, Radio Veteras went off-air when their transmitter was attacked by the military. Radio Bandido, or Radio Rebel, took over the broadcasting of the unfolding of the revolution and announced that Marcos has fled. The people took to the streets, including Minister Enrile and General Ramos, and the Reform the Armed Forces Movement, or the RAM. People were celebrating, not knowing that the Marines were at Camp Aguinaldo preparing to strike Camp Crame. But the Marines did not want to follow the orders and were delaying everything. Eventually, people found out that the news of Marcos fleeing was not true. He was still in Malacanang, hoping for support from the United States. He was trying to contact President Reagan, but no to avail. Marcos then called U.S. Senator Laxalt to ask if the U.S. President wanted him to stay as the President of the Philippines. Paul Laxalt then said to Marcos, "I think you should cut. Cut clearly. I think the time has come." And Marcos replied, "I am so very, very disappointed." So that was that. Marcos surrendered.
The common misconception about Edsa people power. So the first misconception, it was peaceful. So we are talking about the struggles of different sectors of society to remove from power a dictator who was backed by all the powerful U.S. and protected by his beloved military, congressmen, senators, and cronies after sending to prison the remaining vestiges of political opposition. Peaceful also isn't a proper term to illustrate the ideological and mortal struggles of the National Democrats, Social Democrats, and Muslim rebels against the Philippine constabulary, paramilitaries, and armed forces, and the struggles of these groups among themselves. The Philippines at the time was in pure chaos, masquerading as peaceful. The second misconception, it was bloodless. So according to Susan Kempo, martial law damages include 75,730 human rights victims. However, these numbers were only extrapolated from the years 1972 to 1981, when there were already reports of torture and illegal detention. But what about the human rights violation that happened even before 1972? It only means that there are many more frightening human rights violations that are unaccounted for. Understanding Edsa people power demands the appreciation of the different struggles experienced by every opposition in the country, whether armed or not. to reduce all the struggles to a single event while stating that the revolution was peaceful and bloodless would greatly disregard their contribution and be huge a disservice to their sacrifices.
The great success of Edsa is the bloodless revolution by nonviolent, passive resistance and the accession to the presidency of Corazon Aquino. It was a mass movement and relatively bloodless. It was a protest movement against the dictatorship, showing that huge numbers can change the political status quo of the government. Meanwhile, the great weakness and failure of the Edsa revolution is that it was not revolution. It was the return of the exiled dynastic families to power who had lost their economic power against Marcos. So, was the Edsa revolution a success or a failure? It's both a success and failure in the sense that we succeeded our goal of ending the dictatorship and gaining our freedom back. But at the same time, it's a failure since our country is still in its dear state. The Filipinos' lives have not improved.
I will be talking about the key personalities in 1986 Edsa People's Power. There were thousands made possible the historic Edsa People Power Revolution on February 22 to 25, 1986. Some of them remain familiar names in recent headlines while some have been seemingly forgotten. Here are some of Edsa's key personalities and the roles they played in changing Philippine history during those 4 crucial days. Corazon Aquino. She was the widow of Senator Benigno Ninoy Aquino Jr., the staunchest critic of Marcos, who emerged as the leader of the opposition after he was assassinated on August 21, 1983 on his return from exile in the U.S. Marcos called for snap presidential elections in late 1985. She was drafted as opposition candidate with former Senator Salvador Laurel as her vice president. Marcos was proclaimed winner in the elections held on February 7, 1986, amidst allegations of widespread fraud and violence. Aquino disputed the results in a Tagumpay ng Bayan People's Victory rally at Rizal Park attended by at least 4 million supporters, where she vowed to lead a civil disobedience campaign and a boycott of crony-owned businesses to force Marcos to step down. February 25, day 4 of the Edsa uprising, she took her oath as president before Supreme Court Senior Justice Claudio Tenhanki at Club Filipino. Ferdinand Marcos. He was elected as the president in 1965. Marcos declared martial law in September 1972 and stayed on as president until his ouster during the People Power Revolution in 1986. His 20-year rule was marked with thousands of cases of human rights violations, torture, deaths, and disappearances. With the signing of Republic Act No. 10368 or the Human Rights Victims Reparation and Recognition Act in February 2013, more than 75,000 persons as of May 2015 have come forward to file their claims as human rights violations victims of martial rule 1972 to 1986 or as next of kin of victims who have suffered, died, or disappeared during those dark years under the dictator. Marcos died in exile in Hawaii on September 28, 1989. A Transparency in International Global Corruption report has listed Marcos as among the world's most corrupt leaders, having embezzled some $5 to $10 billion during his term.
One Ponsin really. One Ponsin really is regarded as the architect and the implementer of the martial law and the defense minister of under Marcos. But after the 1986 snap election, he together with the General Fidel Ramos publicly declared withdrawal to support for Marcos. He later served as a National Defense Minister Secretary but eventually resigned in the latter part of 1986, and he later became a senator in 1987 and in 1995. And Fidel Ramos. And Fidel Ramos was the AFP vice chief and also the Philippine Constabulary chief under the Marcos administration. In February 1986, he resigned and withdrew support from the government to support the rebel soldiers. He and the Enrile were called out over radio by Marcos, who asked to stop this stupidity. Ramos was also instrumental in the second Edsa revolution against the President Joseph Estrada in 2001.